Welcome to the debate. We are diving into, well, a digital catastrophe that's really become a defining moment for national cybersecurity policy. I'm referring, of course, to the double extortion ransomware attack by this group Crypto24 against Banco Hipotecaria del Uruguay, BHU, that happened back on September 30th, 2025.
Right. And this incident, it's far more than just a typical breach, wouldn't you say? I mean, it led to this mass exfiltration, over 700 gigabytes of really critically sensitive data, PII, financial records, legal stuff, and it prompted a full emergency system shutdown. The economic fallout alone, estimates are suggesting as high as maybe 0.5% of the entire nation's GDP. And recovery? Looking like months. So yeah, this scale of impact really demands we dig into why it happened.
Absolutely. Yeah, the severity of the Guichu incident means we have to move beyond, just a simple postmortem and ask a really fundamental question about causality. Was this successful Crypto24 attack? Was it the unavoidable result of Uruguay's, let's say, long-standing systemic cybersecurity debt and the institutional failures that came with it, validating years of warnings that were frankly ignored? Or was the scale and the success of this breach primarily down to the unique, specialized sophistication of this Crypto24 group, which might represent, an entirely different level of adversary?
That distinction is critical, because if it was systemic, then the response needs to be, well, a wholesale regulatory overhaul, probably. But if it was unique attacker sophistication, we've got to prioritize adapting our defenses, our technology, to these highly tailored threats.
My position, fundamentally, is that the BHU breach was the inevitable, predictable consequence of that systemic failure. I appreciate the forensic detail on the attacker, I do, but I kind of come at it from a different angle. The BHU disaster wasn't really caused by a new or clever hammer, so to speak. It was simply the moment that this national cyber debt, as some have called it, finally came due.
Okay, so what evidence do you point to as the definitive proof that this specific outcome was inevitable, pretty much regardless of who the attacker was?
Well, look, we have years, arguably decades, of evidence that the system was just configured for collapse. Let's just start with the initial access. How did they get in? It began with compromised user credentials, likely snagged via InfoStealer malware. Now, a post-incident analysis looking at the 1,303 exposed user passwords revealed just staggering fundamental negligence. We're talking weak passwords like 12345 and BHU 2020. Those two alone accounted for nearly 15% of the failures.
15%. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So this isn't just poor defense. This is negligence at the most basic user level. And crucially, beyond user error, the BHU's IT setup itself was, well, notoriously monolithic and interdependent. That's an architectural design flaw that pretty much guarantees easy lateral movement across the entire network once just a single point of entry is breached. And this neglect, it wasn't some big secret. The Central Bank of Uruguay, the BCU, they actually issued regulatory sanctions against BHU way back in 2022 for persistent non-compliance with information security mandates. So the institution had 3 full years of formal warning before this thing detonated.
Okay, I appreciate that detail, I do. But, that detail for me only serves to highlight the sheer scale of the opportunity they were given. I'll concede, sure, the underlying technical debt provided the initial vulnerability. But I really have to reject the claim that the catastrophic outcome we saw was somehow interchangeable, that any other threat group could have done the same thing. That's an interesting point you make, though. I guess I'd frame it differently. The extreme damage, the total system shutdown, that staggering 700 gigabyte data loss, that was specifically caused by the highly refined, very tailored methodology of the Crypto24 group. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the outcome would have reached this unprecedented economic, even political scale without Crypto24's specific targeted tactics.
But if the door was left wide open, practically unlocked with weak passwords and almost no internal segmentation, Why does the specific tool used to walk through it matter so much?
Because Crypto24 operates with a kind of surgical precision that really separates them from the high-volume, more opportunistic threats we often see. Unlike, say, the widespread ransomware as a service models, the RAS models like Lockbit, which rely on, variability and mass distribution through dozens of affiliates. Crypto24 appears to be a more centralized, maybe even a standalone group. And this model allows for uniform, really focused tactics. They prioritize high-impact, maybe lower-volume attacks, but they're explicitly against critical financial sectors. They don't seem to rely on luck. They select targets like a state-owned bank specializing in mortgages, specifically because they know the maximum value and the immense pressure that 700 gigabytes of proprietary, highly sensitive data will exert, especially under a rigid 10-day double extortion deadline.
Okay, but targeting high-value sectors isn't unique to Crypto24, is it? What are the specific tactics you're pointing to that elevated this attack from what might have been a severe inconvenience into a full-blown national crisis?
It's their success hinging on sophisticated techniques for evasion and stealth after they got in with those compromised credentials. They're deploying custom malware tools, like this thing called Real Blinding EDR, which seems specifically designed for targeted disabling of endpoint detection and response systems. Now, EDRs, those are the modern defenses designed to catch unusual behavior, right? And they developed a tool apparently tailored to bypass them silently.
The EDR bypass tool, right?
Exactly. Furthermore, they employed what we call living off the land techniques, or LOTL. That means using native trusted Windows utilities, things like psexec, net.exe, for moving laterally and creating malicious services. This let them persist inside the network and then execute the core attack, the encryption and the data theft, during consistent off-peak timing. Specifically, late on September 30th, right during month-end closing, which maximizes disruption while minimizing the chances of alerts being acted on quickly. It's this bespoke, advanced methodology that I argue magnified BHU's existing vulnerability into a total systems collapse.
I appreciate the forensic detail you provided regarding real blinding EDR and the use of living off the land techniques. But honestly, that detail only serves to highlight the sheer scale of the opportunity Crypto24 was essentially handed on a plate. Which brings us right back to what I see as the primary failure: the initial access versus the execution.
Well, I agree the initial access was distressingly simple, yes, but the leap from a simple credential theft to 700 gigabytes exfiltrated and a total network shutdown, that's massive. The execution required, really, advanced persistent threat, or APT, style tactics. The stealth, the custom tools, the clever use of those LOT-L techniques. We are talking about utilizing native operating system tools, which lets them hide in plain sight, bypass signature-based defenses. The very fact that they successfully navigated the network, deployed their bespoke tools, that proves that the sophistication of the attacker, not just the weakness of the perimeter, was the deciding factor in the sheer scale of the breach's success.
See, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because sophisticated execution is largely irrelevant if the defensive architecture underneath is fundamentally flawed. Crypto24's clever use of pexec only worked because institutional failures, like the complete lack of robust network segmentation, allowed that lateral movement completely unimpeded. To use an analogy, it wasn't just that the front door had a weak lock, it was like having a single cheap key that opened every single door in the entire building. That's what monolithic architecture means in practice. The system was already configured to fail catastrophically. The warnings from cybersecurity expert Alberto Hill years ago regarding the structural flaws, remember the earlier theft of 30,000 national PKI certificates and keys he highlighted? Those proved the foundation had deep cracks. The specific type of hammer used, whether it was Crypto24 or any other skilled group, is almost secondary to the fact the entire wall just collapsed instantly upon impact. They were, as he might put it, a sitting duck.
Okay, that's a powerful metaphor, but let's be precise about the threat model itself. If Crypto24's specific tactics are what truly caused this level of crisis, then our resource allocation, our defensive strategies, must prioritize countering those specific tactics.
which leads us nicely into comparing threat models. You've got Crypto24 surgical, focused on EDR evasion, centralized. How does that actual threat profile stack up against, say, the largest, most pervasive threats we face globally, like Lockbit?
Well, Lockbit, yeah, despite its long history and its RAS model, it often incorporates additional, let's say, less subtle pressure tactics like print bombing or website defacement. While they cause a lot of volume, their success is often based on opportunistic deployment across a really broad surface area, frequently relying on affiliates who have varying skill levels. Crypto24, however, I think showcases a highly dangerous evolution of the threat. Their centralized, stealth-focused approach with those bespoke tools like real blinding EDR, emphasizing precise EDR evasion and very careful off-peak timing. That allowed it to execute a surgical, highly controlled, and importantly, undetected data theft initially. Remember, they started the exfiltration on September 30th and weren't even discovered until October 1st. This focused methodology on critical financial infrastructure, to me, makes them a new, concentrated risk that requires specialized defense focused on advanced threat hunting, not just, patching known vulnerabilities. It feels like a higher quality threat, if that makes sense.
I suppose I come at it from a different way. When we're assessing the overall threat profile needed for, say, a national defense strategy. Lockbit's affiliate-driven approach, yes, it's variable, but it has enabled a vastly higher volume of global attacks since 2019. It's one of the most deployed variants historically. Their decentralized execution provides them a wider attack surface, and they utilize a broader array of initial access vulnerabilities, like leveraging catastrophic flaws such as Citrix Bleed or Log4Shell. They also employ diverse exfiltration methods across multiple operating systems, Windows, Linux, even ESXi.
Okay, but if Lockbit is opportunistic sort of spraying bullets and Crypto24 is like a sniper, purpose-driven, why is defending against Lockbit's generalized and varied toolkit necessarily a bigger problem than defending against Crypto24's specific, concentrated, and arguably higher quality EDR evasion tools?
Because the sheer scale of the vulnerability exposure matters possibly more than the refinement of the post-exploitation tool itself. EDR evasion is definitely a hard problem, no doubt, but defending against a group that can potentially exploit a zero-day vulnerability in perimeter devices, which Lockbit affiliates often do, that's arguably a far more expensive and complex task globally. Crypto24's focused TTPs, lacking maybe the expansive toolkit and the long evolutionary history of Lockbit, could suggest a more, let's say, nascent development, despite their high impact in this specific case. And the fact that Crypto24 apparently needed such a simple entry point, those weak passwords, might even suggest their initial exploitation techniques are perhaps less sophisticated than their later execution methods.
But they only needed the simple entry point because the institution provided the simple entry point. They merely exploited the weakest link, one that had been left exposed arguably for years. And that brings us squarely back to the political and the policy failures that enabled this outcome in the first place.
That's a compelling argument about the technical debt. Absolutely. But have you considered that focusing solely on, say, Hill's retrospective validation kind of minimizes the immediate complexity of the institutional response itself? The official political response initially minimized the whole event as just an IT incident. They explicitly avoided terms like ransomware, seemingly to sidestep regulatory and international security reporting triggers. Now, critics argued this reflected institutional opacity, a governance failure, not just technological debt. And this failure to acknowledge the ransomware threat promptly, well, it almost certainly exacerbated the recovery timeline, which again is projected to take 1 to 3 months for full digital restoration. That immediate, opaque governance failure feels like a clear, separate threat, demanding immediate leadership reform, quite apart from the technical debt that built up over decades.
I have to reject the premise that the governance failure can somehow be separated from the institutional debt. I see why you might think that, framing it as an immediate sort of isolated governance issue. However, I'd argue the governance failure is perhaps the most poisonous part of the whole systemic debt picture. Just consider Albert Daniel Hill's own experience. He was actually jailed back in 2017 for ethically disclosing vulnerabilities. That single event demonstrates a systemic pattern of punitive, defensive institutional behavior rather than proactive security investment. The institution's default setting seems to be denial and punishment. So, when the BHU incident occurred, is it any surprise the leaders initially tried to downplay or lie about the extent of the damage? Official minimization of the BHU incident is just the latest, maybe the most obvious symptom of that deep institutional rot that Raphael predicted years ago would eventually lead to a national catastrophe. The BHU incident isn't some random lightning strike. It feels like the inevitable payment for years of accumulated institutional neglect, validated by those prior BCU sanctions and the institutional culture that, frankly, punishes its own security experts.
So you're essentially saying the systemic debt is composed of, what, three equally disastrous elements: the weak architecture itself, the non-compliant technical controls, and this punitive political culture that actively prevents reform.
Exactly. Weak passwords, non-compliant IT architecture, the lack of segmentation, and a culture that punishes those who expose flaws. These are all interconnected systemic failures. And together, they provided the ideal low-friction environment for any capable threat actor, especially one as focused and specialized as Crypto24 seems to be, to cause the absolute maximum damage.
And I would still maintain that while, yes, the environment was tragically ideal, the actual depth and precision of the damage, that surgical evasion via real blinding EDR, the successful theft of 700 gigabytes of high-value data during that precise, off-peak timing, that was unique to Crypto24's highly focused operational model. The failure of the institutional debt certainly created the stage, but it feels like the specialized skill of Crypto24 wrote and performed the tragedy. Fixing the foundational flaws is absolutely mandatory, no question, but ignoring the specific tools and the centralized focus of this emerging stealth-oriented threat means we'll likely fail to anticipate their next target.
To sum up my view, the BHU breach confirms Alberto Hill's warning that Uruguay's accumulated national cyber debt, a debt built on technical neglect, poor architecture, and a deep cultural defensiveness, would eventually inevitably come due. The attack was successful primarily because of those systemic, internal failures that made the entire infrastructure inherently fragile.
In my summary, while that systemic debt undeniably created the necessary vulnerability, the critical, unprecedented economic and political impact on BHU was the direct result of Crypto24's specialized operational model. They focused high-impact, low-volume attacks on critical sectors using bespoke evasion tools and precise operationalized timing. Therefore, future security investment has to address both the historical institutional failures and the specific evolving threat vector posed by this new echelon of specialized, concentrated adversaries.
So, we've explored the tension between fixing profound, long-standing institutional decay and responding effectively to evolving, sophisticated threat actors. The BHU incident certainly serves as a stark warning about the costs of failing on both fronts, failing to maintain fundamental security hygiene and failing to account for focused operational excellence from an adversary.
Indeed. And we leave the listener to weigh the evidence presented regarding whether this massive failure was primarily a predictable consequence of the institution's own deep-seated issues, or perhaps a unique outcome driven largely by the specialized and dangerous tactics of the Crypto24 threat group.